In the ultimate test of endurance, 100 players must survive for 3 days against some of the hardest enemies known to Minecraft, Parasites. Trapped on an alien world, a battalion of players are holed up in the last remaining human stronghold awaiting evacuation, scheduled to arrive in 3 days' time. Meanwhile, after the loss of a ship en route to assist in the evacuation, an escape pod full of survivors crash land onto the alien planet not far from the fortress. The survivors of the lost ship must not only contend with parasites, but also potential hostilities with the soldiers as tensions run high during the brutal struggle between two civilizations. The humans want nothing more than to survive, while the parasites seek only to add more biomass to their collection. In the end, only one faction will achieve victory in this civilization simulation, but the true cost remains to be seen. Each day, waves of parasites will assault the fortress, with the difficulty of the parasites increasing over time. The players have a certain number of lives they can lose each day before hardcore is enabled. The total number of lives over the 3 days is equivalent to that of a battalion. Players also have a shop where they can buy additional equipment using points earned from mob kills. If you want to check out this mod pack for yourself, you can find it over on CurseForge using the link in the description. Shout out to Ish and Magic Gum for inspiration. If you want to see the storyline continued in future videos, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe down below. You can also find streams over at twitch.tv/SpeedFYT. Fortunately for the survivors, no one was lost during the crash landing onto the planet that they were supposed to be rescuing other people from, but now they find themselves in need of rescuing. But they knew they could only be rescued if they were alive at the time of the rescue arriving, so they set about gathering as much gear as quickly as they could from inside the escape pod in preparation for the coming night. Their primary objective was to attempt to reach the fortress, where the majority of the other players or soldiers are located, as it offers a good deal of safety and protection compared to the wilderness at nighttime, not far from the parasite biomes. Meanwhile, at the fortress...
Oh my god. There we go. I have bullets.
I am... yeah.
Right.
Oh shoot.
Ammo.
Oh shoot. I need armor. No!
What is this? Parasitic vesicle.
Guys, save your ammo. Save your ammo, don't waste it.
I need a chest plate. I'm just taking anything.
Ammo.
Edit yourself!
Any ammo. I can't hear anything over there.
After the initial mad dash to the armory, in which it was looted in about 0.5 seconds of all of its gear, the players spread out and began doing different tasks. Some of them who had materials started reinforcing the defenses, began building a secondary wall outside of the main wall, this one much closer to the parasite biome. They even stuck some machine gun turrets there in an effort to defend against the eventual parasites, who were, in fact, just becoming aware of the presence of a large group of soldiers at the fortress. They were slowly beginning to appear out of the surrounding infected biomes in ones and twos, but never in any great force. And the ones that did decide to show themselves were quickly dispatched by multiple armed players or turrets within the vicinity. While the majority of the soldiers were still stationed at the fortress, there were certainly some of them who left and began seeking refuge in the surrounding mountain ranges. A couple of them even stumbled upon an abandoned plane up in the mountains, while a few others began a small group that would later be known as Mountain Gang. One of the soldiers by the name of DeKerby used the abandoned plane to travel back to the fortress and attempted to land it in the hangar, but the plane had some other ideas and proceeded to freak out and just teleport all over the map instead, which was fine. It got DeKerby where he needed to go, which was inside the hangar to mine steel blocks from the walls. Meanwhile, the players stationed at the various walls in front of the fortress were about to be tested as the parasites launched their first full frontal assault, consisting of a horde of assimilated polar bears and horses and other denizens. The initial wave of parasites proved to be no match for the players and their machine guns and flamethrowers, with the support of the heavy turrets on the wall in the back. But the parasites had learned something from the encounter. They had learned that they would need even stronger forms if they wanted to take out the soldiers. Around that time, some of the survivors began arriving at the fortress right after the soldiers had just defeated the first wave. They didn't stick near other players very long though due to uncertain hostilities, and they decided instead to slip up the mountain and to one of the upper machine gun turrets in a secluded spot far from the other players, but also still within the confines of the fortress. A second wave of parasites spawning shortly after also proved to be plenty of distraction for any one of the soldiers who might have been curious enough to go investigate where the survivors were. While most of the soldiers were focused on defending their fortress from hordes of parasites, other players had different priorities, namely stealing as much food as absolutely possible from the cafeteria. Oh man, I really would not have wanted to have been this soldier right about now, if only they had known that a mere couple dozen blocks above them were several huge parasite forms slowly digging through the mountain, intent on adding another member to the hive. Speaking of digging parasites, another large parasite form had dug an entire tunnel from a cave system far below the fortress just to make it out of the ground and die immediately to one of the autocannon turrets on the wall. However, it opened up a passageway that other parasites and monsters could follow if they wanted an easy route inside the fortress. Most of the soldiers were a little bit too occupied with the new wave of parasites to pay the tunnel that had been opened up very much mind, as a lot of parasites had just arrived and were attempting to dig through their first line of defenses.
Broke the massive machine gun and it dropped ammo and all this stuff.
Oh
Wait,
no!
let's
We
pick
should
it all
never
up.
have broken that. We should never have broken that. Uh-oh.
Let's pick it all up. Let's go.
Steve's gonna
It's
be
engineering
upsetting.
blocks. I love engineering blocks.
Could have been setting up camp at the extreme.
You guys are so bad. Oh my god. Yeah, Flip is actually so other than bricks.
Wait, no, go broken. Press that into the furnace.
I have a.
Oh, we got airborne. We got
Yes.
airborne.
Airborne.
I don't have sound in my car. I just realized.
Okay, we're going.
Wait.
Just give me flame
Okay.
stairs for
Okay.
some reason.
Who do I follow?
Some of the first flying parasite forms were seen in large numbers in a new wave that spawned a few minutes after the survivors broke the machine gun turret on top of the fortress. And in addition to those flying forms, a large number of assimilated Endermen spawned, all of which with the capability of breaking blocks. Speaking of breaking blocks, or maybe lack thereof, the parasites that had been digging toward that one poor player off in the mountains gave up their attempt, but they didn't need to actually kill the player themselves because the player dug into a cave that had some zombies that immediately eated the player instead, so it didn't work out very well. By that point, some of the soldiers had enough points that they could afford air support and began buying planes, which was just in time for additional waves of parasites to emerge from the infected biome. This time, however, the soldiers had air support and they were ready with multiple flamethrowers ready to go and obliterate the parasites in short order. All of this wasn't even quite enough though to stop some of the parasite forms from dealing some damage to the wall before they were toasted into oblivion. To make matters worse, a huge parasite form emerged from the depths of the parasite biome, but was luckily taken down by concentrated fire from almost every single soldier on the wall. Back in the cafeteria, the survivor who'd been taking all the food previously decided that that alone wasn't enough and that they needed not just the food, but the entire kitchen as well. The soldiers were pretty chill about their kitchen getting stolen by one of the survivors. You know, the survivor and soldiers just kind of hang out in the fortress, gave each other some steel, bought some stuff in the shop, and generally had a good time tearing down everything inside the fortress for materials. While the kitchen was getting stolen, the rest of the survivors were on their way to the mountain ranges far from the fortress and the soldiers, where they hoped to establish a settlement free of both parasites and other players alike, as both would prove to be equally dangerous to them in the coming days. As the sun emerged from behind the mountains in the distance the next morning, one could almost forget that they were fighting a losing war against hordes of parasites. You could almost forget if it weren't for that one dude with a flamethrower down there. Since they didn't have to defend a fortress all the time, the members of Mountain Gang were busily expanding their settlement inside the mountain, and they had even dug an entire pit all the way down to bedrock level and were in the process of filling in a ladder. The same beautiful morning experienced by the survivors up in the mountains was also arriving at the fortress, but it was marred by the hordes of abominations streaming out of the parasite biome, intent on eliminating every single player within sight. In contrast to the epic battle taking place between player and Parasite, there was an epically slow PvP battle between a survivor and a soldier happening in a little pit in one of the mountains. It went on for a really long time. This footage is sped up a lot, but eventually the soldier won and a survivor was killed. The outer fortress wall constructed by players was becoming more advanced by the minute. There was now a lower level with gaps for players to shoot out of and spaces for machine gun turrets. But there was a new threat arriving in the form of pods falling from the sky. These pods would land on the ground, presumably die, but still would release a massive explosion a few seconds later, damaging anyone nearby. Luckily, all you have to do to avoid them is just not stand near them, which for most players was a fairly easy thing, but at least one of them, as we can see here, was eliminated by a pod. Shortly after the pods fell from the sky, the final wave of parasites for day 1 arrived and proceeded to breach through the wall almost immediately, but were quickly stopped on the other side by the heavy turrets guarding the fortress. Up in the mountains, the survivors had begun building a shelter to live in not far from the extraction point, and one of the lone soldiers had discovered that you could dual wield pistols and shoot them at the same time, which is something I didn't even know, but now I do thanks to him. Day 2 of recording arrived, and the Mountain Gang proceeded to build a massive bridge leading to the extraction point from their mountains, so as to make an easy highway to prevent players from having to traverse the dangerous valley below them. Already, even on day 2, a full day before the extraction was supposed to arrive, players were already congregating in the general vicinity. They were flying planes around, they were making a small airport even, and they were just hoping to avoid parasites, which they could for a while. The large group of survivors were also upgrading their base as well with more stuff. They built a big staircase going down to bedrock, kind of similar to how Mountain Gang made a giant pit with ladders, only they had a staircase. And the brave soldiers defending the fortress waited with great trepidation for what the parasites would throw at them on day 2. They knew that it could only be worse, as the parasites had to have learned a lot from the defeats of the first day. In fact, the parasites wasted no time in sending a massive parasite form out of the biome, not even part of a wave. It just came out of the depths of the forest and proceeded to rack up 2 kills almost immediately before taking the entire combined firepower of everyone at the fortress to kill it.
Everyone's level goes to 0. PvP is enabled, I think. Yeah, because 50 is when hardcore is enabled, and 0 is when PvP is driven.
Gets to 80,
So that's everyone's combined max.
How people die, right? You never die. Like you can die for things.
But that giant parasite was just a shadow of what was about to come, as right on the heels of its death, the new wave spawned, bringing with it even stronger forms than what we're seeing yesterday. It took mere moments for the outer wall to be destroyed by numerous parasites, but as they breached through the wall, they came within range of the defenses of the fortress itself, which began opening fire and laying waste to many of them. soldiers narrowly defeated the wave of parasites, but not without losing both heavy flamethrower turrets at the front of the fortress and also sustaining heavy casualties.
The tunnel gonna start getting. We should probably retreat to the tunnel.
After the stragglers of the wave were eliminated, the soldiers quickly began repairing what they could of the fortress's defenses. Unfortunately, the resources on hand are not sufficient to fix the complicated machinery of the turrets themselves, but they can repair the wall to some extent. Of course, they also have to avoid being picked off by miscellaneous parasites emerging from the parasite biome, like this one did here. The soldiers did manage to successfully repair the outer wall, enough to be able to use it to defend the fortress from the next several waves of parasites, which they did so pretty easily despite many flying forms arriving to join the parasites. A small group of soldiers, part of Mountain Gang off in the mountains, had actually decided to make another portal and went through the Nether to go see what they could see on the other side. They didn't find very much out of the ordinary though, just a few run-of-the-mill cyber demons, nothing very dangerous or exciting, and they didn't take very long for them to return back to the overworld. In addition to journeying to the Nether, Mountain Gang also made history by being the first group of players in any of my Civilization events to establish an international airport. They created, with one damaged plane and a tiny runway, the first international airport known as Mountain Gang. Their lair had become quite advanced as well, with several new entrances and exits and some farms, and for some reason a bunch of excavator bucket wheel thingies all over the place. Oh, and of course we can't forget about Larry. Larry's most important. Or the collection of pilfered items that came from the fortress, namely garden cloches and a partially completed reactor. The parasite hive mind seemingly had become aware of the actions of Mountain Gang and dropped a very targeted pod onto their bridge, blowing a giant hole in it. During the actual event recording, I spent so darn long watching this parasite dig out of the ground really slowly, only to just emerge and immediately die to an autocannon. It was the most depressing thing I'd ever seen. Luckily, the coolest thing I think I saw the entire event happened right after that depressing moment. This person had the best bomb drop I've ever seen a player have in this game, and it blew up a ton of parasites with just one bomb. The majority of the soldiers awaited anxiously on the outer wall. They knew that the final waves of Day 2 would be arriving soon, and they needed to be ready as they could be for hordes of parasites that would undoubtedly attempt to breach their walls. Which is exactly what happened a few minutes later when another massive wave spawned with many of the strong parasite forms, all of which intent on breaching the walls. A group of the parasites wisened up and decided to go around the wall instead of trying to break through the unbreakable blocks, and instead they just smashed through the side of the mountain. Too few players remained at the fortress anymore to successfully defend against all of the strong parasites, and some of them made it through the inner wall and were barely stopped before reaching the bunker itself. Speaking of bunkers, a few players had decided to make their own really tiny bunker underneath the actual fortress and were just hanging out down there, perfectly safe from all the parasites, while their friends were getting massacred above them. The most recent engagement with the parasites was enough to tip the morale over to a hardcore being enabled for the first time in either of the event days, just in time for the final waves of parasites of that day to spawn and go rampage toward the players. Very few people remained at the fortress after the crushing final wave of yesterday's recording session, but the few who did remain were in for an even worse time with day 3 level raids, but at least they had the extraction to look forward to if they made it out alive. By that evening, the fortress was all but abandoned. Almost everyone had fled to other parts of the map after dying too many times there to too many parasites. Many of the defenses were also destroyed. The front autocannons were taken offline in the next wave that spawned, and there was really no point in being there anymore, especially with the extraction not far off.
Okay, anytime.
And 10 and
Chemical map.
hardcore will be enabled.
How many?
12.
Unsurprisingly, almost everybody was either already at the extraction point, or in the vicinity, or on their way there, which was probably a smart decision and seemed great. You know, it's a safe spot, there's no waves spawning there. Oh wait, parasites learn over time. They're not going to let all the players just sit there for a solid 45 minutes without spawning some waves nearby. For a time, tensions were rising between the survivors and soldiers, as the place where the survivors had holed up in the mountain was under 100 blocks from all the soldiers at the extraction point. But the individual squabbles were soon forgotten about as more and more parasites began arriving on the scene. Later that night, the first true wave of parasites was detected at the extraction point. Luckily for the survivors, it consisted only of slow-flying bombers, which never got close enough to begin deploying their payloads, but it was still the sign of worse things to come. Meanwhile, back at the fortress, the last remaining soldiers still holed up there in the shop were being forced to retreat back into the caves that had been opened up into the shop by a bunch of digging parasites earlier on. However, things weren't much better at the extraction point, as the newcomers arriving were faced immediately with a new wave of parasites, this time much more dangerous than the bombers. Not all of the soldiers were participating in the battle though, as some of them had done the much more honorable job of moving their Larry statue outside of the mountain and into an outdoor shrine. It also appeared to morph into a shrine for the event mods as well. If only their shrine to Larry had been able to save them from the enabling of hardcore later on that morning. Almost as if the parasite hive mind was aware that the players were weakening, additional waves were immediately sent to the extraction point, consisting of even more parasites, including more dangerous forms than seen previously.
We are absolutely fighting for this. Also, there's a tornado.
Oh,
I like this shot.
Okay.
That's the weather machine, Okay, get inside, we're inside.
Oh wait, get inside?
Get inside, we're going.
The battle between the soldiers and parasites was briefly interrupted when someone spawned a tornado using a weather machine underneath the hill, and it proceeded to fling all of the parasites into the sky, which was kind of beneficial, but it also meant that all the players got flung as well. Luckily, not too many of them died, for their sake. With the extraction arriving in under 10 minutes, players from all corners of the map were converging on the extraction point at the hilltop. Tons of people were arriving via the bridge from Mountain Gang, and the survivors were not far behind either, just approaching from a different direction, trying to keep out of the main battle as long as they could. But the battle was about to come to them, as a bunch of parasites were busily digging through the mountain to come out of the floor underneath them.
Also, there's still a bunch of mana.
Oh god!
I'm gonna die, genuinely. I am not dying here. Not here, not now. I must eventually die.
By that point, the Parasites were arriving in full force, in greater numbers than even seen attacking the fortress. They knew that this was their last chance to kill as many of the soldiers and survivors as possible before they fled the planet. Things were looking very bad for the players as ancient forms began spawning and joining the attack, but they would only have to wait a few more seconds.
Guys, can you please
I
don't?
got a plan now. Wait, head to extraction.
Do extra.
I see him.
Dig it. Yeah, that is definitely a bit. It's like right by me. I am concerned.
I know, I'm coming to shoot this thing now. Ow, that, oh no!
Angel!
No!
A city burned down to ashes, memories lost in vain. It's only gonna make us stronger as we heal the pain. Can you hear the sirens? Can you see the enemy line? I feel it coming closer. We're braver than a lion. We're steady in our state of mind, keeping our composure.
Despite losing the majority of the battalion stationed on the planet, several dozen survivors nevertheless were able to escape on transports. The rescue fleet's original orders when setting out were to land a massive ground force on the planet in order to retake it from the Parasites. However, due to the loss of one of the ships that was supposed to rendezvous with the fleet and the accelerated takeover by Parasites, the mission was switched to a rescue and scuttle operation. An officer aboard one of the ships performing the base Delta Zero was later heard commenting what a shame it was that such a nice scenic planet was wasted in such a manner. He had, quote, been very much looking forward to a nice retirement home on said planet once he was out of the Navy. After several days of orbital bombardment, with the planet turned to slag and the mission complete, the fleet makes the jump to hyperspace en route to a naval station in the Valduja system to unload the survivors and refuel. But that's all for this part of the story. I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you want to see what fate befalls the survivors now that they've escaped, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe with notifications on for more. Thanks for watching, I've been Speeve, and I'll see you in the next video or live stream. Bye!
You and me, we're on tonight. There's a breeze and fading light, far away to open sky. Lonely beach where no one goes. Open eyes and open roads. What we dream is what we know.